Welcome to the MSDW Podcast. I'm Jason Gumpert, editor at msdynamicsworld.com, and it is time for another Microsoft Dynamics and Azure News Roundup. I'm joined once again by our assistant editor, Eamon McCarthy-Earls. Hey, Eamon.
Glad to be here, Jason.
And let's jump right into it with some of the recent headlines that we want to talk a little bit about and just highlight today. Let's start with some roadmap updates. On the dynamic side, one of the things we saw recently was an update to the SMB ERP cloud migration roadmap. So this was Microsoft's approach to getting its, I guess you'd say, legacy SMB ERP customers, those on Dynamics GP and Dynamics Nav and Dynamics SL, to Business Central. What we heard was new tooling coming to the market that will make all of those customers' lives a little easier if and when they choose to go to Business Central. And I think what was interesting there was not just sort of the new features, but sort of the change in focus, where it seemed like at first, maybe 6 months or a year ago, a lot of the focus was on, well, let's see your data in the cloud. Now it's, well, let's make it really, let's make the path to the cloud as painless as possible for as many of these customers as possible. I think it's an acknowledgement of how valuable all those GP and Nav and SL customers are to Microsoft as a revenue stream and as a group that's really under pressure. Or that Microsoft is under pressure to keep happy, as there's plenty of other SMB ERP solutions out there in the market that would love to get the business of all of those organizations, whether it's Acumatica, NetSuite, Intact, SAP, take your pick. There's a lot of options that they have out there. So I think this is my read on it anyway, is Microsoft making a little more of an effort to do that. And also I should note, trying to make use of cloud technology as they do it. I think a lot of what's going on behind the scenes is them getting better with the use, or maybe just spending more time, I should say, building out sort of cloud tooling that enables this data migration work in hopefully a more standardized and simpler way.
And I really think that's an interesting point to make, because I think, even if you go back 6 months or a year ago, there was a lot of concern sort of in the GP and Nav world that, these older, very well established ERP systems were sort of getting left behind and a little bit ignored, I think particularly among GP users. So I think it's very interesting that Microsoft has begun to signal, no, we're not forgetting about you and abandoning you. We're actually planning for the future so that you can stick with what you have and prepare for a future where you can sort of port that stuff over.
Yeah, I mean, the roadmap even included Azure Data Lake, which obviously is becoming a more prominent component of Microsoft's ERP cloud architecture overall. They've been talking about it more and using it more, I think, with finance and operations, but I think it makes sense that, the same sort of R&D organization finds ways to use that and sort of, promote it to an extent with these smaller firms too.
We've also seen quite a bit of indication of new investment around Power Platform and Dynamics 365, according to Hayden Stafford, the corporate vice president for Microsoft, focused in the business applications area. And what was your take on this, Jason?
So this was an interview that I listened to on Mark Smith's podcast. Mark Smith being a business applications MVP who runs, well, I guess there's three podcasts really, and has tons of interviews on it. One of them was Hayden Stafford, who's in charge of sales for the business applications group. And he's someone who I personally almost never hear from. I think he's mostly talking to Microsoft and channel sales, leaders, which I'm not one of. So I'm just really not, usually there for his presentations. Nevertheless, it was really interesting to hear his plans. And, a couple of them jumped out at me that I really, either wasn't aware of or hadn't sort of put together, I guess, in the way that he summarized it. And top of that was, this $250 million in extra spending on sales and partner support headcount through the rest of this year, which, he clearly sees as a big victory, as a big sign of Microsoft, how serious Microsoft is about about building up that sales force. And I think it's just a sign of how serious the company is about trying to kind of boost not only Dynamics but Power Platform revenue, and find ways to make Power Platform really a component of more and more, deals in the partner channel overall. So, if nothing else, I just thought that was that was worthy of calling out, because I hadn't sort of heard his way of positioning it before. So yeah, again, thanks to Mark for getting that out there, and I think we needed to, anyone really needed to amplify it, and yeah, for sure, listen to the entire podcast that Mark did.
We also heard announcements about Dynamics 365 Virtual Agent for customer service, which is now in general availability. This is an interesting one as well, with sort of the shift toward more customer service focused bots.
Right, and this is like you said, it's sort of I don't want to call it the end story, but it's really the sort of the business facing result of, I think, what Microsoft has grown from its sort of base layer bot framework up to something that's very sort of specifically made for this for this purpose, so that companies that don't have sort of experts in bot programming or whatever, or building out the AI and the logic and all that, can sort of use it sort of a user-friendly drag and drop approach to building out pathways and types of dialogue and conversations for the purposes of their customer service department, using them in the context of their live agents, and having sort of the virtual agent doing certain things and the live agents doing other things, and they leave it to the customer, I'm sure, to really define where that line is. But seeing this come out of preview and into general availability, I think is an important milestone for I guess I missed a step too. So there's the Microsoft Bot Framework. Then there's also now we understand like a Power Virtual Agent, which is, I think, sort of a middle ground between the D365 virtual agent for customer service and the Microsoft Bot Framework at the sort of lower end. So you have sort of these three levels of of product or product line that customers can kind of get into the Microsoft's bot or landscape at to some extent. And to see this one at the top end, sort of the nearly finished option, get into general availability, I think is probably an important step.
Likewise, on February 3rd, we saw Dynamics 365 Commerce, the successor to the previous D365 Retail, enter general availability with greater sort of AI features, and also with the connected store in preview. So that's an interesting shift as well, sort of along similar lines.
It is. It's really, on the one hand, it's just the next release of the D365 Retail product, with the introduction of new features, e-commerce engine, but I mean, it's like the commerce aspect, the e-commerce aspect is important, but it's also really not the whole story, because if you look at the list of areas in which they've made enhancements and improvements and new features, it's not just about e-commerce. That's like one section of the story, and the team is really not selling an e-commerce engine. I mean, that's very clear, and it doesn't appear that they have any, at least at this point, any plans to really make it that. It's really e-commerce in the context of what they like to call omnichannel retail.
For my part, I've had some interesting conversations recently with Matt Allington. He's a Microsoft MVP based in Sydney, Australia, with a particular focus on Power BI, for which he does quite a bit of consulting. And I've had a chance to do a few different conversations with him along the way, which have always been very, very interesting. He's really got his finger on the pulse, really, of the Power BI world. A few of the takeaways of sort of what he sees going on in the Power BI space right now is a big shift toward ever more Power BI consulting sort of demand in the market. Additionally, he sees it as sort of one of the most affordable BI options out there. We actually went a little bit into some of the licensing and how that compares with competing solutions. So it was very interesting. I recommend you check out that interview when you get a chance. Similarly, I also had a chance recently to hear from a number of different experts about public cloud trends within the 2010s. Looking back over the last decade, we've really seen Azure, AWS, Google Cloud, and other smaller players sort of come to fruition and gain substantial market share. It's been an interesting sort of graph in some ways, where traditional data center spending has stagnated while public cloud spending has increased year over year after year at a very steady rate. So it's been very interesting hearing from people in that field. A whole bunch of activity with partners around hybrid cloud, and Azure particularly is pretty well positioned for that, it seems, was a general sentiment that I heard. And many predict that we'll see increasing amounts of infrastructure, platform, and software as a service offerings as we head forward into the 2020s from here. So again, that's also an article I recommend that our listeners go ahead and check out.
Yeah, both of those were really interesting perspective. I mean, going back to the Power BI sort of feedback that Matt shared, I mean, the demand was really the interesting thing, and I do wonder sort of what that will, how we'll be able to sort of see that from our perspective. It's great that he and people like him presumably are getting great demand for the services, and that makes me think of, what are the hiring trends, and when are we going to see more about sort of Power BI in the, showing up in earnings reports and in analyst calls and things like that Microsoft does, or analyst days that they have that are public facing. It really is, it does make me wonder sort of when some of that, because what I always hear from Microsoft people when they're talking at a conference or answering questions is how happy upper management is with the performance of Power BI. I just wonder when it gets to a scale that they'll really be shouting it from the rooftops, so to speak, to Wall Street.
Yeah, it'll be very interesting to see that trend.
My take from the from the Azure perspective that you gathered and wrote about was how quickly, obviously 10 years is not a huge amount of time, but I guess in when it comes to public cloud, I mean, everything that's happened in the last decade is fairly easy to sort of look at without being too far away from it. It seems like the people you talk to have really adapted very quickly and they're just expecting kind of a constant like stream of changes that they and that customers are going to be adapting to.
Well, we've also been very lucky to have a continuous stream of our own of expert features. First among them in our list today is a recent piece by James Crowder looking at Dynamics 365 Business Central priorities that he has this year. That was a really interesting one. I know you collaborated with Crowder on that. What was your perspective on his ideas?
Well, I mean, I think he is as ardent a supporter of the future of Business Central as anybody. He's also an astute, entrepreneur in his own right, a shrewd Microsoft partner too, who I always look at it as he's looking as closely and as carefully and as strategically at his options as any partner is, and it's just great because he's also willing to be to talk about them to an extent and sort of put himself out there a bit with his views. I think this is something that probably will resonate with a lot of other partners. If you haven't seen it yet, he's had some very supportive comments, just on the site in response, and he raises some issues that I really maybe hadn't thought of or hadn't sort of seen from, I wasn't able to put myself into that mindset enough to identify. So, and then others are fairly obvious, I think. For example, some of his recommendations are fairly, nuts and bolts or straightforward in terms of, control of updates, and when you're and the idea of what partners really need to manage customers at scale with Business Central, and the idea is that they should each be, if they're trying to get to hundreds or even thousands of customers of this cloud platform, they're going to need to scale their the available tools that they have from Microsoft if Microsoft really wants to control things. And then finally, I would just say the call for functionality gaps, the idea that the kind of requests that existing customers make for new features is not going to be the same as the kinds of necessarily the strategically planned enhancements that are all about capturing new market share and winning new deals. And, he kind of calls that out, which I certainly appreciate. And I think, he's really pushing for there's no doubt people in Microsoft who are pushing for the same thing. And he's, I think, trying to throw his hat in on that. That let's go Microsoft. Let's do more around product innovation on features and functions. Now that you've done so much around re-engineering for the cloud and a lot of very obviously very difficult, complex things that they've already successfully done to sort of make it a SaaS product.
We also heard from Nicholas Hayduk talking about Power Apps portals and sort of the Wave 1 release plans for 2020, which is a bit of interesting perspective about the growing list of sort of options for low-code, no-code developers to work within Power Apps portals. And we also heard from Peter Jekyll, who's been doing a series for us going back to 2019, looking at the challenges surrounding ERP migrations, particularly sort of migrations from Dynamics AX to Dynamics 365. And he continued very much in that vein, looking at some of the risks you can run into with Cloud ERP.
Peter always brings an interesting perspective to the Cloud ERP debate, and it's a little bit contrarian sometimes. But it's also really grounded in his real experiences with customers. I think it also just reflects this kind of the range of companies that are looking at ERP today, that are either looking at an upgrade from AX or just examining or deciding about D365 F&O or even Business Central. The story of the move to Cloud ERP is not fully written yet. There's a lot of companies out there that still have to embark on this journey. So there's just a lot of perspective still to gain. Thanks for mentioning the piece by Nick Hayduk. He really just did a great job of breaking down some of the things that are in the new release notes. Let me just look at a couple here. So, I think one of the themes is there's still a ways to go on. There's a lot of new capabilities, but it's still not sort of the sort of it's not really super friendly yet to non-programmers. I think they're moving in that direction, that it'll be more control for power users or admins or business users, but there's still a lot that developers need to do, but importantly there's great updates like a web API where that will give people new options for how they're going to develop on the server side. On the using JavaScript, so maybe not necessarily on the server side, as you would have done with or as you do with the Liquid, programming approach. So before I dig myself in too deep on the on the customization stuff that I actually don't do, I'll leave it at that. But good perspective on some of those capabilities, other product enhancements, and it just seems like portals is an area where more and more people are going to be looking, because as Nick always says, at some point most businesses realize they probably need a portal for one reason or another, or maybe a few.
And I will also draw our listeners' attention to several pieces by Satish Panwar, looking at some of the technical aspects around VICS compliant bill of ladings with Dynamics 365 supply chain management, revenue recognition for D365 finance, and
multi-part series on revenue
multi-part
recognition.
series. And lastly as well, a really good piece on planning for creating and maintaining extensions, which is great for Business Central.
Yeah, I'm just going to also add that we will be having a podcast episode soon with Satish and one of his colleagues, Sukrut, talking not in detail about any of these particular articles, but touching on them and also looking more broadly at his perspective and his team's perspective on F&O projects.
Jason, what else is on your docket as we move forward from our podcast today?
I've got a couple of events I'm going to be covering in the near future here, and that always is a nice chance to meet up with people and have some new and interesting conversations. I will be at the 365 Power Up, one-day event in Florida in another week or so, actually less than a week. And then I will be at the user group Community Summit Europe 2020 in the Extreme 365 Europe event that are going to be in Barcelona in the beginning of March. How about you?
Well, for my part, I'm going to be focusing on some of the themes of hybrid cloud raised in that recent look back at the public cloud in the 2010s. So look for some upcoming articles about both security aspects of hybrid cloud and really where the trends are going right now, involving Azure and sort of the other systems out there. So we should have some interesting coverage in that area in the days to come.
Excellent. I look forward to it. Well, with that, Eamon, I think we are ready to wrap up. Thank you so much for joining today.
Thanks for having me, Jason.
If you want to get in touch, you can reach out to me by email, jgumpert@msdynamicsworld.com. Until next time, this is MS Dynamics World, signing off.